Good evening, and welcome to tonight's lecture with Dr. Martin Dean, The Shifting Sands of Babi Yar, 80 Years On, Analyzing the Evidence and Incorporating Jewish Responses. My name is Avinoam Pat. I'm the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. I am pleased that tonight's program is sponsored by the Herman and Gertrude Shepard Fund for Holocaust Education. And as this is one of the first programs in a series of programs that we will be offering and specifically focused on Holocaust education, sponsored by the Shepard Fund, I wanted to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about Herman and Gertrude Shepard. Herman Shepard was a longtime resident of Plainfield, Connecticut, who passed away in March of 2017 at the age of 90. He was the beloved husband for 64 years of Gertrude Skolnick Shepard. Born in Sosnowiec, Poland, he was a survivor of several concentration camps, including Gross-Rosen and Buchenwald. He was liberated from Buchenwald by American soldiers in 1945. In 1949, he came to the United States, to New York City, and moved to Plainfield and became a farmer and real estate developer, active in local and state politics. He was also a founding member of Temple Beth Israel in Danielson, and served on its board as president. Gertrude Shepard passed away in April of 2019 at the age of 91. She was born in December of 1927 in Łódź in Poland. At age 12, she was separated from her family and spent the years of Nazi occupation in Siberia. After the war, she returned home to discover that she was the only member of her family to survive the Holocaust. She lived in a DP camp near Kassel in Germany, and from there she immigrated to the United States and also worked on the family farm in Plainfield, Connecticut, and later at the Plainfield Greyhound Park, and was active in Temple Beth Israel in Danielson, which she co-founded with her husband, Herman Shepard. She continued to support Jewish organizations throughout her life and in her later years. And in addition to being an avid reader who closely followed politics and studied history, she was also a big fan of UConn basketball. So I want to thank again the Herman and Gertrude Shepard Fund for Holocaust Education. And I know that both Faye Shepard and Rochelle Rubin are here tonight with us for tonight's program. So thank you so much for your support. We are this week in the intermediate days of Sukkot, normally Moadim L'Simcha, a period of joy and happiness. But next Wednesday and Thursday, September 29th and 30th, is also the 80th anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre, where more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were shot by units of the SS and police force. And Dr. Dean's lecture, which we'll hear tonight, will follow new evidence from photographs, witness testimonies, and aerial images to piece together the landscape as it existed on September 29th and 30th, 1941, reconstructing the route taken by Jews. Highlighting new research, Dr. Dean will also describe the mood of Kyiv's Jews on the eve of the massacre, acts of escape and resistance along the way, and the fate of Jewish property in the city. As United States Holocaust Memorial Museum historian Edna Friedberg noted in an article in yesterday's Washington Post, the massacres of hundreds of Jewish communities perpetrated across Eastern Europe in the autumn of 1941 have been a largely ignored chapter of Holocaust history. 1941, she writes, isn't the Holocaust narrative that we are used to. There are no cattle cars, no barbed wire fences, no shaved heads or striped uniforms. This is the Holocaust by bullets, not by poison gas or starvation. This is the final solution in the maelstrom of war. German killers and countless local accomplices struck at the heart of Jewish life in Europe in such places as Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, unquote. I'm grateful to Dr. Martin Dean and other scholars, some of whom are joining us for the program tonight, for focusing our attention on this aspect of the genocide of European Jewry, perpetrated in not some faraway locale, thousands of miles away, but down the street on the edges of town where neighbors saw neighbors being murdered to disappear forever. Dr. Martin Dean received his PhD in European history from Queen's College, Cambridge. He has worked as a researcher for the Special Investigations Unit in Sydney, Australia, and as the senior historian for the Metropolitan Police War Crimes Unit in London. As a research scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, he was a volume editor for the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. His publications include Collaboration in the Holocaust, published in the year 2000, and Robbing the Jews, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 2009. He's also the author of a chapter in a volume I recently co-edited on teaching the Holocaust with Ghettos, a wonderful chapter based on his path-breaking project, the Encyclopedia of Ghettos, which is really a monumental achievement that Martin and the team of research scholars achieved at USHMM. He is based in Washington, DC, and works as a historical researcher for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. And tonight, his lecture, we're going to hear more about his most recent research project, which is a detailed analysis of the Babi Yar massacre, combining aerial photography, ground photographs, and witness testimony. Now, just a few technical details before I turn the screen over to Martin. We are, as you have noticed, we have not enabled you to unmute yourselves. This is just a way to minimize distraction and disruption during the lecture. I would encourage all of you to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen as you have questions for Dr. Dean while he's lecturing. And at the conclusion of his lecture, we're going to have plenty of time for a Q&A, and I'm going to try to moderate a discussion of the questions that are coming in through the chat. So with that, it is my honor to turn the screen over to Dr. Martin Dean. Thank you, Martin. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Abby, very much. And for your kind introduction. And my thanks go also to the sponsors tonight, the Herman and Gertrude Shepherd Fund. Today, I will examine the complex history of Babyn Yar. It serves as the most powerful symbol of the Holocaust by bullets, the Nazi mass shootings of Jews on occupied Soviet territory. But even today, many details of what happened there are still shrouded in mystery. It was to resolve some of these unknowns that I engaged in a large-scale research project for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center 2 years ago. Essentially, this mass shooting took place soon after Himmler ordered the Nazi security police to expand the target of their operations to include Jewish women and children, and it encompassed the destruction of the Jewish population of an entire city over the course of just 2 days. Using photographs, witness testimonies, and aerial images, I'll reconstruct the route taken by the Jews into the ravine and identify the location of the mass shootings. By following the discarded property and clothing of the Jews, captured in contemporary photographs, this leads us like a trail of breadcrumbs to the site where the massacre took place. We will also examine the responses of individual Jews along the route and the measures taken by the Germans to confiscate Jewish property. Finally, we will examine German efforts to conceal and destroy the mass graves, as well as the post-war Soviet denial of the Jewish identity of the majority of the victims. The Einsatzgruppen were the SS and police squads that followed the army into the Soviet Union to deal with declared enemies. These squads kept detailed records of their mass shootings that added up to more than 1 million victims in total by mid-1942. Reports give the place, date, and number of victims for their shooting operations. Those shot are described mostly as Jews. Einsatzgruppen report number 106 states that 33,771 Jews were shot at Babi Yar on September 29th to 30th, 1941. By August 1941, mass shootings were an almost daily occurrence for members of the Einsatzgruppen. Here you see the method used in June and July of 1941 for smaller mass shootings that resembled the procedures of a firing squad. The mobile Einsatzgruppen were specially designed teams of about 3,000 men, consisting of security police, guards supplied by the Waffen-SS and order police, and many police drivers who also participated in the shootings. In addition, there were translators and other support staff, some of whom were recruited locally. The Einsatzgruppen was supported also by police battalions, local auxiliaries, and the Wehrmacht. From the start, the Einsatzgruppen targeted the Jewish intelligentsia, but increasingly also all Jewish men of military age between 18 and 45. From mid-August, one Einsatzgruppen after another started to expand the killings to include women and children. By September 1941, complete Jewish communities were to be exterminated in newly occupied towns and cities. The German security police used deception to encourage the Jews to report and facilitate their murderous plans. So Kyiv was well into the German invasion of Ukraine and wasn't captured till September. Before that, there were already a great expansion of mass shootings starting in the west here, Lutsk, was where Einsatzgruppe 4A started their operations. And following the largest mass killing prior to Babi Yar, Kamianets-Podolsky in late August, there were also mass shootings conducted in Zhytomyr, Berdychev, and Vinnytsia. So in these three large cities just to the west of Kyiv. I've actually been to Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr and know the locales there quite well. Then on September the 19th, the German army entered Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, after a prolonged battle in which the city became encircled. The battle north of Kyiv bought some time for the Soviets to evacuate industrial workers, some industry, and government officials out of the city. Among them were large numbers of Jews. Probably more than 100,000 Jews managed to evacuate, leaving some 50,000 or so behind. The evacuation of industry by the Soviets was a major accomplishment, which enabled them to resume key production further east. Jews were not given priority in the evacuations, but many of them were saved from Kyiv nevertheless. Conditions for the evacuees, however, were still very harsh. For example, as a railway employee, Fera Schwartz's father was evacuated with his family at the beginning of July 1941. They could only take very little luggage. Fera recalled, "We only took the most necessary clothing, my toys, my bed linen, and a few pots." They were evacuated to Magnitogorsk, but soon her father was called up to the Red Army and was killed at the front. My mother and I were starving and freezing because we didn't have any winter clothes. In early 1943, Fera's mother died of pneumonia. Her grandmother remained behind in Kyiv and was killed at Babyn Yar. At the end of the war, Fera was an orphan. Some Jews, such as Sarah Shulman, were sent soon after the German invasion to dig trenches in the vicinity of Kyiv for several weeks. As she explained, "I was a Soviet person, they told us to go, and so we went." On her return, her parents had already been evacuated. Then she fled from Kyiv just in time and served with a nursing unit near the front. Later, she was evacuated to Central Asia. We went on a freight train. Our trip lasted for over a month until we arrived in Uzbekistan, 3,000 kilometers from Kyiv. We rented a hut from an Uzbek man who allowed us to pick tomatoes from his garden. The local population was friendly and we didn't face any anti-Semitism. On returning to Kyiv in 1944, she found that her grandparents had been killed at Babi Yar. German forces finally entered Kyiv on September the 19th, 1941. Then just a few days later, on September 24th, several large explosions wrecked buildings used by the German military administration along Kyiv's main street, the Kreshchatyk. They were caused by mines set off by the Soviet security service, killing dozens of people. The resulting fires that burned for a week, together with German containment measures, caused widespread damage in the city. Thousands of people were made homeless. On September the 25th to 27th, SS leaders and Wehrmacht commanders held meetings in Kyiv. They decided to murder the city's Jews as a reprisal for recent explosions. Placards calling on Jews to present themselves at a specific road junction near Babyn Yar were posted around the city by the Ukrainian police on September 28th. The threatened punishment for not complying with the instructions was death. The Jews speculated as to what this could all mean. Some feared the worst, but most expected that there would be some form of resettlement. Jewish teenager Vera Bogutska, for example, noted, "Most people were of the opinion that we would be sent away to work. My mother packed up our things. I saw the streets were full of people carrying luggage. Some of them had carts. They were all going in one direction. Towards evening, my mother and I left our apartment with our luggage. We went down several streets with many other people. The collection point was near the Jewish burial grounds. In response to the placards, more than 20,000 Jews took to the streets of Kyiv on September 29th. This photograph, taken by a German in Kyiv at the time, is inscribed on the back, "Jews taking their last journey on earth." Even at Babyn Yar, it is important to think of the Holocaust as a process comprised of several stages. Raoul Hilberg has described the four main stages as follows: definition, concentration, confiscation, and destruction. As we see, the events at Babyn Yar also followed the same pattern, only the events and processes that were spread over some 10 years in Germany were compressed into just 2 days at Babyn Yar. Here we see a 3D model reconstruction of the first checkpoint created by the spatial tech team in Kyiv, led by Max Rockman-Eco, using available data about the terrain. The checkpoint is described vividly by Jewish survivor Genya Batasheva and other witnesses. It was the place where non-Jews accompanying friends and relatives had to turn back, vehicles could go no further, and the Jews had to continue on foot with only what they could carry. From here on, the Jews were more closely guarded, with little chance of escape. Rebecca Schwartzman and her family were accompanied to the checkpoint by a non-Jewish neighbor and her 2 daughters. The Germans were armed with machine guns and some were on motorbikes. One of the non-Jewish women was carrying Rebecca's 1-year-old son as they reached the checkpoint. As the fair-haired baby boy was being returned to Rebecca, the German guard asked if she was Jewish. "Yes," she said, but then the guard insisted the pretty blonde boy must go back. He then indicated to Rebecca and her sister they should flee. Rebecca extracted herself from the crowd with the boy and made her way to one of the cemeteries, where she hid in a crypt for the rest of the day, breastfeeding her son to keep him quiet. Leonid Puchter, who was a driver for Sonderkommando 4A, gives this account of his journey out of Kyiv that day. "I drove out of Kyiv and came to an alley. There was a checkpoint which let me through. I saw that along this alley there were Jews marching. They were going in groups as if for a stroll. On the left lay enormous piles of luggage. It looked like a huge pile of potatoes. The Jews threw their luggage onto this pile. At the end of the alley on the right, there was an open area where the registration took place. At the end of the alley of trees, the Jews were forced to surrender their documents and then were formed into groups for the next stage of the journey. Some were transported by truck and others marched on foot through a brutal narrow corridor of guards and then into the Sand Quarry. Here you can see the alley of trees in the background. This view of the alley of trees is seen from above is from 1943, but it gives roughly the same layout as in 41. Here you see the alley here, and actually you can, if you look back to the previous photo, you can sort of see through to the window of this building looking the other way. And this is where the luggage was lined up on the left-hand side. Later on, even they also piled up luggage against the fence that was on the left-hand side here too. And probably here on the right around here, maybe a bit further on, was where the registration took place. The question is often asked why the Jews didn't do more to resist. In approaching this question, it is important to stress that the vast majority of Jews who took to the streets on September 29th to 30th in Kyiv were women, children, and the elderly. So almost all men of military age had already been conscripted or evacuated. As one eyewitness recalled, there were women, elderly people, and children. The adults were at the war. Then there was the high level of deception practiced by the Germans, which carefully concealed the real aim of the order for the Jews to assemble. Many Jews thought that they would be transported by the freight railway station close to the cemeteries. As a result, most Jews came to realize their fate only too late when they began to hear the shots. By then, they were already within the tight police cordon that offered almost no chance of escape. Nonetheless, there were quite a few miraculous escapes. This is the story of Ruben Steins, a Jewish teenager at the time, and he recalls, "From the first steps of our journey, I began to look for a possibility to escape from the column, but how and in what manner? The column was escorted by Nazis who were armed, and when there was only 250 meters remaining to Babyn Yar, I jumped unnoticed out of the column into the ditch alongside the road and crawled into a drainage canal that ran under the street and sat there until it became dark. When the columns were not coming past so frequently, I climbed out on the other side of the street and went through the old cemetery and through the vegetable gardens to the edge of the city. In the night, I then made my way home. So this marks the route that's clearly well known. This street leading out of Kyiv is known as Melnikov Street. And from here, they went past, first of all, a checkpoint was around here, was at Pugachev Street. These here are probably the garages where some of the Jews were then held overnight. Initially, they were going straight past this. Later on, they go through this area, I think, and some of them were put in the garages and then taken out the next morning. Here you see the Jewish cemetery on the right here. For a long time, it was thought that the Jews may have gone through the Jewish cemetery towards Babyn Yar because it seems like one of the most direct routes. But actually, this later photograph is a bit misleading because the Jewish cemetery this time was full of trees, so would have been almost impassable, certainly for vast numbers of people, and the Germans wouldn't have done that. It would have been too easy for people to escape. So what they did was they went up to this junction here and then turned left down what's called Kahatna Street, and then right here to the alley of trees, Dorogozhitska Street. And here they come to the end of the main ravine. This is the ravine of Babi Yar you see here, and this is the main ravine. And here you'll see what's called the Western Spur. And this is actually a photograph from 43. So this is the Sirets camp, which wasn't built until 1942. So this didn't exist at the time of the Babyn Yar massacre, but it was also a place where people were held later on during the occupation, and they were taken here also to be shot at Babi Yar. And it seems from all the evidence I've seen that most of the shooting, especially of the Jews on these days, probably took place in this Western Spur here. And they were held in the Sand Quarry. What's not quite so clear is how they got from this point here to the Sand Quarry, but it does seem most likely that they went probably along this fairly shallow part of the ravine and then up here into the Sand Quarry this way. It's possible they stayed on this area a bit longer and then went down and across it. Some may also have been brought by truck along this road and then up this road here and then entered the Sand Quarry here, being delivered by truck probably at the entrance to the Sand Quarry. But this is the infamous Sand Quarry, which for a long time was a mystery because it's simply not marked on a lot of the maps. So this is the statement of Jewish survivor Yevgeny Yekel. He also reports his miraculous escape. From Melnikov Street, the flow of citizens headed left towards Dorogozhitska Street, and then along this street towards the end of the Lukyanovsky and the military cemeteries, and then to the right along the natural boundary of Babi Yar. At this point, the Nazis stood in two rows tightly next to each other and created a living corridor, along which they drove the people doomed to death in a continuous stream. In this area, I stayed with my father. Now, I do not remember exactly where, but at one point there were many small ravines, and here the guards were standing farther apart. Seeing this, my father pushed me into one of the ravines and he followed me. We went out of the ravine to the cemetery where we waited until late at night and then left for my father's house. So just going back to the previous screen, probably the ravines he's talking about are these ones here, possibly the ones going this way. And here are the other two. There are three cemeteries altogether. One is roughly here where the woods are. One is in this area here. And then the Jewish cemetery is further over on this side. And this is the sort of main ravine going down here. So the main clues we have about the route of the Jews after this are a series of photographs taken shortly after the massacre by the German propaganda photographer Johannes Hehler. So he's the man standing taking this photograph. And here you see clothing piled up in a large sand quarry. This is the other famous photographs by Hehler. And apart from showing vast piles of clothing in the sand quarry, they also show here POWs covering over the ground in a long, steep-sided ravine. This is almost certainly covering over where the bodies had been shot a day or so earlier. But where were these photographs taken? This was the difficult research goal that the BYHMC historical team, under the leadership of Carol Birkoff, set itself in 2019. To correctly identify the shooting ravine with the POWs, I used the lone tree on the skyline you can see in these two images as a reference point. This was visible in photographs of the main ravine taken after the war, but you can't really see it on this one of the halo photograph. But in fact, if you go in very close, you can see that the lone tree is there, but it's obscured by the trees behind it. You see again, this was the visit of Mayor LaGuardia from New York in 1946. This is a short video taken of that. This is taken down the main ravine. And here you see the halo image where it's very hard to see anything on the ridge here. But if you actually blow it up and enlarge it, you can just see that there is actually the same lone tree on the edge of the ravine, but you can't see it because of the screen of trees behind it. Literally, you can't see the tree for the woods. So by comparing these two images and also the sides of the ravines in the two photos, it seems to be much steeper in this one than in this one. I came to the conclusion that there were actually two separate ravines, and the most likely one for the shooting was definitely this one, where you would have the trees behind it, whereas looking the other way, there was nothing behind where the tree was, so you would just see sky behind it, so you see the tree on the skyline as you do in this image here. So this confirms that the halo ravine is different from the main ravine, as it has quite a different angle on the lone tree. By using aerial photography, we were then able to pinpoint where halo was standing on the road at the end of the Western Spur, close to where the Syrians camp was later built. By enlarging the aerial photo, we were also able to identify the Sand Quarry, which lies between the two branches of Babyn Yar, close to where they meet. So this is the Sand Quarry here. You see it on the main photo there. Its location had been difficult to ascertain before, as it is missing from almost all maps, including the 1924 topographical survey used to originally construct the 3D model. The reason for this is that the Sand Quarry itself was only created in the late 1930s and had disappeared with changes in the landscape after 1950, when a new road was built through the area. The shifting sands of Babi Yar served to sow confusion that has confounded historians for years. So this again is a reconstruction using the halo photographs and other images we have of the Sand Quarry. Most of the Jews were forced to undress in this area. This is confirmed both by witness statements and by the halo photographs. This overhead view has been prepared using the 3D model, and it enables us to determine the position of the discarded clothing as seen in the halo photographs. As you see, it seems to indicate that the bulk of the Jews walked around in this direction towards the left and may even have sort of ascended the easiest way up this slope here. And then this is probably where they entered the shooting ravine, although there may have been more than one entrance to it. Some may even have come around this way to go into this way. Others may perhaps later on have come in down the sides further down, depending how they organized the operations. Again, I stress this is a reconstructed view made very recently by the Spatial Tech 3D modeling team. The Jews were driven into the left corner of the Sand Quarry to enter the Western Spur up a slope and through a specially created passageway, the Notch. Albin Pover, a German policeman present in the Sand Quarry during the shootings, testified, in the ensuing hollow there were throngs of assembled Jews. The Jews had to undress at the end of the Sand Quarry. When partly naked, partly in their underclothes, up over a steep slope and disappeared into the adjacent valley or behind a mountain slope. From there, one can hear shooting. So this map, actually drawn quite a few years ago, shows the likely location of the mass shootings in the Western Spur. So I'm not the only person to have this idea, but the same map also shows several other locations for shootings, some of which are accurate, some of which are probably more dubious. As many as 3 or 4 separate shooting squads were probably operating along the length of the ravine here. And this indicates roughly where Halo was standing. So he's looking down the ravine, and you see here it bends to the right towards the end. And this is where he was standing when he took his iconic photograph of the POWs covering over the ground. This is the Sand Quarry again to the right. This is from 43, this image. We don't have a good one from 41, unfortunately, but the Sand Quarry doesn't appear to have changed very much in the interim, although I'll explain some of these strange markings later on. So once again, we'll look at the Halo photograph in a bit more detail. He's looking straight down the shooting ravine. And his image matches very closely a description by a German driver, Victor Trill, who was standing at roughly the same point where he parked his truck during the actual shooting. Looking from the bridge, Trill reports, the depression made a turn to the right, where behind this curve, a large round depression in the ground was located. So he's talking about the Sand Quarry up here. It's possible that this comprised a former sand or gravel pit. In this pit, there were also countless people, who I can safely assume were all Jews. Also in this pit were mountains of clothing of all sorts. So again, you see the photographs and then the witness descriptions are matching up quite closely. I won't mention it in much detail, but to cover over the bodies, it seems they actually blew up the sides of the ravine after the end of the second day of the shooting. And this managed to throw literally several meters of sand on top of the bodies, and this explains also why the ravine sides seem to be much steeper here than they would be naturally. So that does seem to be confirming it. And this was literally just a day or so after the explosions took place. So there is one eyewitness testimony that confirms the explosions, and a lot of not direct testimony, but people who say that's what happened, although they weren't there at the time. So we're pretty sure that that's what happened. So most Jews probably entered the shooting ravine from this notch here from the Sand Quarry. This was also likely the spot from which Dina Pranicheva, one of the Jewish survivors, fell into the ravine from above. So she was shot at the end of the day and was able to more or less to jump off the edge into the pile of bodies without being actually hit herself. A few Jews may have descended into the main ravine on the right to enter the Western Spur from its junction with the main ravine. So there were probably at least 3 or 4 different groups of shooters. They obviously didn't want to stand too close to each other in case they might end up shooting each other. But this is probably roughly where the shootings were taking place. So Pranicheva has testified about 10 times. Carol Birkoff has compared these testimonies, although there are some minor discrepancies. It does give us a lot of very useful information about what happened. And she claimed to be non-Jewish, and she was put to one side while most of the shooting was taking place. But even at the end of the day, she reports the German officer arrived and said that we should all be shot, as even if one person got away from here, they would talk. And the next day, not a single Jew would appear. We were all led to be shot at the Sandy Notch, but we were not forced to undress because it was growing dark and the Germans were tired. Coming out of the so-called door from this notch to the left, there was a small ledge where all the people formed up and were executed from the opposite side with machine guns. People fell into a very, very deep abyss. I shut my eyes, squeezed my fists, and threw myself down before a shot came. Of course, it seemed to me that I was flying a whole eternity because I was very high up. I felt neither pain while I was falling, nor the impact, nothing. My only wish was to live. So Pranicheva was very lucky. She subsequently crawled out of the pile of bodies and managed to survive. So now I'll talk a little bit about the Jewish property that was collected. So when they were sent to the Sand Quarry, initially the idea was to collect the valuables off them as they went past, but this was sort of slowing things down too much. So it seems one of the reasons why they were forced to undress was it was the easiest way to make sure that they got most of the valuable property. This is a document I found in the Berlin archives in the 1990s. It was sent by Sonderkommando 4A from Kyiv, and it lists hundreds of items of jewelry that were collected from Jews as they took their last steps into the ravine at Babyn Yar. The list includes 63 ladies' watches, more than 300 rings, 95 decorative chains weighing in total more than 2.5 kilograms. This was likely only a fraction of the total collected there. So in this photo, we see members of the SS searching the discarded clothing, probably for any hidden valuables. The clothing itself was also transported away in trucks and stored in warehouses for distribution to needy ethnic Germans or for sale to the local population. Of course, there was also private theft on a massive scale that accompanied the official looting. Police battalion members recall sorting vast piles of ruble notes, which they were told were worthless, but were still used later on. And this is one of the halo photographs. It's not quite clear why he took this. These are not kind of official German propaganda photographs, although he was working as a propaganda photographer. But it's interesting that he even took this picture, which has a photograph left lying in the sand, captured on the day after the shooting. So this is kind of a time capsule of what happened on that day. You can see how the clothes are just scattered as people have been forced hurriedly to move on. The furniture left behind in Jewish apartments in Kyiv was also officially confiscated by the German occupation authorities. This meant that non-Jews who moved into apartments in late 1941 also had to register any property left behind. They were then given the option of either purchasing it or handing it over to the German authorities. In this document, a local inhabitant agrees to purchase former Jewish furniture and to pay for it in 6 monthly installments. Among the items purchased are one dining table, one bookcase, one small table, one bed with a mattress. There was also a buffet, a child's bed, and a sofa. So as I mentioned, later on, very close to the shooting ravine, the German security police under Erich Erlinger in April 1942 established a so-called work education camp at Syria. It's kind of a concentration camp. So initially, when the security police arrested people, they either shot them or released them in very unusual cases. Later on, they also decided to set up this camp to use the work of the labor of some prisoners. So it's not true that absolutely all Jews were killed in Kyiv in September 29th to 30th. Obviously, a number managed to hide, and a lot of those were then captured in the days after that, and they were among groups of prisoners who were taken to be shot at Babyn Yar in the months and even years after 1941. There were a few Jewish laborers who were held for a while in the Karasina POW camp and then sent to various other labor camps within Kyiv. Wasn't more than a few dozen really, but those people were put to work mainly helping with construction work that the Germans were doing in Kyiv. And later on, some Jews were even brought from Western Ukraine, from Volhynia, and they were used either to build a bridge across the Dnieper or also to work. I think they were actually doing some kind of agricultural work, but based in the Pechersk Lavra building, which is actually next to the main cathedral. It's like some church buildings next to the main cathedral. They were held there. Unfortunately, almost none of these other Jewish prisoners survived. Only a few that were in the Syriac camp later on did manage to survive, and I'll tell you that story in a moment. In its final phase, some of the prisoners, including Jews, were used to burn the corpses and cover the traces of German mass killings at Babyn Yar. So they took sort of the remaining 100 or so mainly Jewish prisoners from the camp and used them to exhume the corpses at Babi Yar. This was part of a huge effort starting in 1943 called Special Operation 1005. It was led by Paul Blobel, who had organized the original massacre of Jews at Babyn Yar in 1941. He was tasked with trying to erase all the mass graves in the east, an impossible task, but due to lack of time, it was only partially completed. Apart from around 15 prisoners that escaped, all the others involved in burning corpses at Babyn Yar were shot on completion of the work. So here we see the Sand Quarry. And what I want to explain here is this is actually one of my first major discoveries using the aerial photography. Here you can see what are actually sort of two bunkers, or in what they were is they actually built like a barracks already half buried in the sand, and then they put more sand on top of it. And you can see there are even steps here at the front where people went in. So there'll be 200 or 300 people were housed here altogether during the work to exhume the corpses. And here you see the shadow. This is quite interesting. This is almost certainly the shadow of a guard tower, which was very similar to the guard towers they had outside the Syriac camp. And so this is in the Sand Quarry, and they would literally go every day over this notch and work in the Western Spur of the ravine here, exhuming the corpses. And then just as the work was ending, they got a tip off from one of the guards that their time was coming up next. They actually burned the corpses by creating huge pyres with as many as 1,000 or more corpses on each one, which were then covered in petrol and burned. So this was a big effort to cover up all traces of the the mass shootings before the Soviets recaptured the area. They very sacrilegiously, they were forced, or the Germans organized the use of headstones from the Jewish cemetery, were literally ripped out of the Jewish cemetery and brought here, smashed up and used to build the basis for the pyres. And then they also had wooden logs to stack them up with the corpses so that it would burn easily. So a very complicated procedure was made for the exhumations. But fortunately, about 15 of the prisoners managed to escape, and they testified in some detail, both to the Soviet authorities and later on at a German trial, giving the details of this. And interestingly, the descriptions of the German guards of these two bunkers match very closely exactly the same descriptions by the prisoners, and one was bigger than the other, and they had this sort of step at the entrance as you go in. So was only discovered this a couple of years ago by really looking closely at the aerial photographs. This is Yakov Karpa, one of the prisoners from the Syrets camp who managed to escape, having been in the exhumation commando, and he testified at the trial in Germany at Darmstadt about Babyn Yar. This was another survivor from the exhumation, and here he's showing actually another view of the Western Spur, which resembles that of Haile. He's a little bit more to the left than Haile was standing, and here again you see this crescent-shaped hill in the distance. You can't, I don't think, see the actual tree, or definitely you get slightly the same sort of angle you get from the Haile photograph. And he's saying this is exactly where the exhumations took place. So we have this corroboration after the war as well. So Babyn Yar remained a very controversial site for many years, especially under Soviet control. Yevtushenko's 1961 poem, Babyn Yar, after his trip to Kyiv with the author of the novel Babyn Yar, Anatoly Kuznetsov, in August 61, it has the opening line, "No monument stands over Babyn Yar," which at that time was certainly true, and it was an indictment of Soviet suppression of information about the Holocaust. The poem became a rallying cry for Jews and other writers who gathered regularly at Babyn Yar for commemorations in the following years, despite strong discouragement from the Soviet authorities. The Soviet memorial was eventually completed in 1976, but it referred to the victims only as peaceful Soviet citizens, continuing the Soviet policy of concealing the Holocaust. It must be said that a lot of other victims, or non-Jews, were killed in and around Babyn Yar, not necessarily in exactly the same grave as the Jews, but in other graves close to the same site. And so it is a site of contested memory for that reason, but obviously the main massacre of more than 30,000 people is what should be remembered most. And it's only after the fall of the Soviet regime that you got a decent memorial to the Jewish victims was placed, which is, I examined this in 2017. It had been there for more than 10 years by that time. And there are now plans for a considerable number of further memorials. There is actually quite a good outside memorial still left from the 2000s, which has images of some of the ones I've shown you, in fact, and is placed pretty much where some of the shooting took place, although it's hard to tell, of course, because the ravine itself no longer exists, where in the Western Spur. But additional sites are now being added, including a decorative synagogue was put up recently, which is a kind of a pop-up synagogue, but it's very beautiful. And I think it's certainly not in a place where shooting took place. It's just on the edges of where the main ravine was and where no burial actually took place before. And they're also planning to install a version of the 3D model that will be partially underground. Again, not directly at one of the major sites, but close by so people can get access to it. And the long-term plan is to have a large-scale memorial center and museum, again, on a site that's been carefully chosen not to harm any possible buried remains. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to some interesting questions. Abby.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. If you don't mind, I'm going to stop your screen share. There we go. And I will add myself to the spotlight. Okay, here we are, side by side. So I would thank you so much. Let's do a sort of a virtual round of applause as if we were in a room together for a fascinating lecture. Thank you so much, Martin, really for sharing new areas of research on both the history of Babi Yar, but also piecing together the evidence in the way that you have, also for us to understand exactly both what happened and then the cover-up and the sort of initial forms of denial of the crimes that were perpetrated there. I want to invite the audience to please feel free to submit questions using the chat function. I'll be happy to ask questions of Martin as they come in. I'll start with a first question for you, Martin, which is, you know, from the perspective of here we are 80 years later, and you know, we're thinking about both commemorating the anniversary of the massacre that took place in Babi Yar, but also the importance of highlighting why this history must be taught. And as you alluded to, for a long period of time, both under the Soviets and then subsequently, it's not a feature of Holocaust history that has been a focal point, both the Holocaust by bullets and the massacres perpetrated at Babi Yar. So, you know, part of the goal of these series of Holocaust education programs that we're doing is also to provide resources for teachers here, both in the state of Connecticut, where we have a mandate to teach the Holocaust and genocide, and also for our students at the University of Connecticut and for research purposes. So why do you think it's important for this aspect of the Holocaust to be taught? Why do you think, you know, we should have more attention focused on a massacre like Babi Yar, but also on this aspect of the Holocaust by bullets?
There are lots of reasons. Obviously, the neglect for many years means that we do have still quite a bit of catching up to do. And it's sort of impacted not only the Soviets sort of conceal it from their own population, but because researchers couldn't get access to this material for decades in the West, also most of our sort of dominant narratives focus much more on the information we had. And even working as a researcher in the last 20 years or so, one of the biggest problems was having access to photographs. There are not many photographs. So I am pleased to say that we have found quite a lot of new photographic material, as well as obviously the aerial photographs. And now we're obviously trying to fill a little bit of the gaps with 3D modeling and reconstructions. I'm not a big fan of reconstructions. I have reservations about that. We're trying to base some of the reconstructions as close as possible on the photographs and on the testimonies and what other information we have. But they do able you to sort of visualize what happened in a way, and it's always been done. There were 3D models. There are 3D models in the Holocaust Museum in Washington and in many other museums. And I think it's a legitimate way to help people to sort of imagine what happened without obviously going too far in terms of graphic content. And that's really where I would draw the line of any kind of reconstruction, that there's no need to reconstruct graphic content that didn't really exist, I don't think.
I want to ask about, so we use this number of 33,771, which comes from the reports of the Einsatzgruppen. Based on the research that you or others have done, is this an accurate number? Should we, you know, be using a number that is a much higher number to reflect the number of victims massacred at Babi Yar? What do you think is the accurate number?
I certainly think for the 2 days of 29th to 30th of September, we will never know. It's obviously not the exact number, although it is a very exact number. There are records of the Germans counting people. And one witness in one of the trials said he was ordered to count the children, and he didn't actually come to a very high number. But it does show that there were some efforts to record it. I think the Germans were definitely obliged to report some kind of number. And I'm not sure how diligently they did that. After the war, they were trying to claim that the numbers were inflated and that actually less people were killed. But from the population of Kyiv before the war, which was as much as 200,000 Jews, it seems that obviously more than 33,000 Jews were killed in Babi Yar altogether. For a long time, the Soviets were using a figure as much as 200,000, or certainly at least 100,000. From my calculations, that is too high, even if you include all the non-Jews as well. That the only way you could possibly get that high is if you include a lot of POWs who were killed around Kyiv, but not necessarily in Babi Yar. Then you might get to as many as 100,000. But my estimate is that as many as another 10 or possibly 15,000 people were killed in and around Babi Yar in the months after 1941, which would make a total of just over 50,000. Probably is more accurate for Babyn Yar itself. But there were literally tens of thousands of Soviet POWs who were killed to the east of the city in Donetsk. Some were also shot close to Babyn Yar, although the figures for that are definitely hard to verify. There is one figure of 25,000 given by even some survivors, but it seems to be too high in my recollection, because we have almost no information of that number of POWs being brought there and shot. It's probably more in the order of hundreds or a few thousand at the most, I think.
So we have a couple of questions that have now come in from the audience, and the first two are actually related to a certain extent. The first one from Michelle asks, how did the non-Jewish citizens of the city respond to the evacuation and massacre of their neighbors? And I'll add to that, both because I think you alluded also to the abandoned property, which is something that you've also researched in other contexts. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the responses at the time and then in the aftermath of the massacre?
It's very hard to generalize, because there were obviously a lot of intermarriage in the Soviet Union at this time. So you had non-Jews going with their family members, saying goodbye to them, and they were obviously not happy about this whole thing and were quite shocked by it. There were others who were in some ways envious of the Jews or were anti-Semitic. So even in the Soviet Union, there was anti-Semitism, and this comes out much more as V. Gittelman's research has shown as the war goes on, that actually anti-Semitism seems to increase in countries like Ukraine during the war, and even in the Red Army to some extent. So there were people who were sort of jeering at them as they went past, or trying to grab the property as soon as it became available. And certainly Kyiv was notorious for anti-Semitism after the war as well. So Jews who returned faced quite a bit of anti-Semitism in that city. So I don't want to generalize too much about it, but there were both reactions. My analysis of the massacre itself is the role of Ukrainians in this process was not on a large scale. Main reason was they only formed the police units there like a couple of days before. So they literally only captured it on September the 17th, and they were just in the process of establishing the first police units. So there were Ukrainian policemen involved. They were certainly involved in forcing the Jews to undress and in guarding around the site. Some people may have been acting as translators as well, but most of the shooting was certainly done by Germans, and not just members of the Einsatzgruppen, but members of the police battalions as well. Several members of Police Battalion 45 admit to being shooters at Babyn Yar and give quite graphic descriptions of what they were doing. So we know it was mostly done by the Germans, but they needed some local help. It was a large force. More than 1,000 Germans were organizing this whole event. They had concentrated literally a whole regiment of police in Kyiv at that time, as well as quite a lot of Einsatzgruppen members. The Wehrmacht seems to have played a key role in organizing the massacre, but you don't see them playing much hands-on role in actually carrying it out. So they were sort of both ordering it and sort of facilitating it in different ways, getting the placards printed and things like that. But I haven't seen many descriptions of Wehrmacht people actually at the scene, other than maybe a couple of generals who wanted to see what was going on. But there may have been other Wehrmacht people there. The thing is that the German investigation just focused on the police members. In terms of property, definitely very many Ukrainians benefited from the Jewish property. The Germans obviously tried to keep the most precious things for themselves, and a lot was sent to Berlin, not only from Babyn Yar, but from hundreds of other sites in the east. So the most valuable items were literally sent to Berlin, so they could be either melted down and even possibly sent to Switzerland if they were gold or silver, or certainly sold internationally, things like gems, or used to support the German economy in some other way. So there was a big effort, although I think that the main reason that everyone was forced to undress was more to get the valuables that might have been hiding the property, than because they definitely wanted all those coats and things, but they then did use the coats afterwards. And as I say, many local people would get those coats. And there is a description of actually the fields after the snow had melted the following spring, and people still saw items strewn across the fields leading to Babi Yar, things like strollers and hand carts and even passports had been buried by snow during the winter and then merged again the following spring. So there was such a huge amount of material sort of discarded along the route that you couldn't really miss it for months afterwards. So that's partly how I've sort of constructed this project, is by following the trail of evidence to find out which way they went and where the shooting took place.
I think you responded to the next question from Lisa about people who were not Nazis who assisted in carrying out the massacre, in terms of sort of Ukrainian involvement, the local population, but also, as you alluded to in your talk, sort of there were some non-Jews who either happened to be there accompanying their family members or people who wandered up to the site to see what was happening and
Yeah.
were almost killed for being in the wrong place at that
Some were
time.
killed for being in the wrong place. That was really quite terrible. The people that by accident got within the cordon, some of those never got out. One or two did get out. One or two Jews got out as they claimed they were non-Jewish, but certainly half or more of the people who were non-Jewish who got trapped in that cordon were actually shot.
I'm wondering just about the specific context of this period in September of 1941, because as you talked about, you know, the Einsatzgruppen that are following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, we start to see this wide range of shootings taking place all across Eastern Europe with the advance, you know, going into July and August, and here we are in September, very soon after the arrival in Kyiv and the end of September. But as you mentioned in your lecture, there's this series of bombings that take place right in the heart of Kyiv at the time. Can you say more about both the context of what's happening with these bombings in the heart of the city, and also how this was used as an excuse basically to carry out this massacre, and perhaps how the population might have responded to it within that very specific context of this 1 or 2 weeks of time after the German occupation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like how the Germans also used the massacre of prisoners in Soviet prisons. So when the Soviets withdrew from parts of Western Ukraine, which had been Poland before the war, they massacred some of the prisoners there because they couldn't take them with them. These were mostly actually Ukrainian nationalists who'd been arrested by the Soviets after they took over in 1939. And the Germans made a big show of this and sort of forced Jews to take their bodies out and then use that as a sort of way of whipping up anti-Semitic mood in those places, and as a pretext for then murdering Jews as a sort of reprisal. So in a similar way, the Soviets blew up the center of Kiev because they realized they were going to retreat, and that they were pretty sure that the Germans were going to use the most suitable buildings to rule the city. So they want to deny that. This is part of the sort of the Soviet scorched earth policy, the same as removing the factories, that they really didn't want to leave anything behind that was useful to the Germans. But again, the Germans tried to twist this and say, well, it was Jewish saboteurs who did this. The Jews were even, according to the German propaganda, sort of cutting the hose pipes to the Dnieper so the fires couldn't be put out, and they used this as a pretext for doing what they planned to do anyway. They were certainly going to try and kill the Jews shortly after arriving in the city, but they sort of adapted it to the circumstances and probably used this to convince the Wehrmacht to get it done as soon as possible. I think Kiev is fairly unique in that it happened so soon after the German arrival, and it was sort of so complete, and the Jews had really very little suspicion that there are a number of Jews who did turn back, especially once they were able to hear the shots, or on the second day once people were warning them. But initially, most of them did think that they would be taken to the railway station, which was quite close by to the cemeteries. And therefore, it wasn't until they started going beyond the railway station and then hearing the shots that people really realized what was going on. So in that sense, it was a little different from many of the other places where the Jews had either a bit more warning, or they waited longer before they tried to shoot everyone. But here, nearly everyone was sort of captured in this sort of 2-day period, just 10 days after they arrived. And that's often how people sort of depict the Einsatzgruppen killings, but actually in many places there were 3 or 4 different actions against the Jews. It wasn't all done on sort of one big operation. And then often ghettos were established, and there's sort of some sort of forced labor was extracted from the Jews before the shootings took place later on. And that happened even in Kharkov, further to the east. They arrived there, I think, in November and set up a ghetto in mid-December, and it wasn't until beginning of January that they conducted the shootings there. I think one of the reasons for that may have been that they just didn't expect to get the same degree of sort of success with just putting up posters and telling people to obey, because the Jews probably wouldn't have believed that. Although even in Kharkov, most Jews did report, and unfortunately, this sort of Soviet mentality of doing what you're told didn't help them until they sort of were warned a bit more over time that this was not a good idea.
We have another question. This one is from my colleague in the history department at the University of Connecticut, Charles Lansing, who asks, can you tell us about what resulted from the German investigation? How many indicted and convicted? What kinds of punishments were handed down? So tell us a little bit about the post-war trials that did take place.
Yeah, there are about 3 or 4 trials that are of significance, although the Soviets had many, many more trials, and that's still an area which if I get time, would be interesting research is to what extent they pursued people. Of course, unfortunately, very few Germans were captured by the Soviets, so you don't get much useful testimony from the Germans there. But the Germans, there was obviously in the Nuremberg trial, they had the Einsatzgruppen trial, and one of the defendants there was Paul Blobel, who was the main architect of Babyn Yar, and he was actually hanged at the end of that trial. So there was one piece of justice was done with the help of Ben Ferencz, and it was fairly clear cut that he deserved that. There weren't even too many Germans who felt sorry for him when they knew about his activities. And the Einsatzgruppen trial was very important in just emphasizing this mass murder by the German security police, which was recorded by themselves. Their own documents convicted them, so there's very little they could defend themselves there. Later on, they did try to put on trial in Germany about 9 other members of Sonderkommando 4A, so the main Einsatzgruppen unit that conducted or organized the massacre, although there were other police leaders there, as I mentioned, also the police battalion members. In that trial, again, only 2 or 3 of them were convicted. Most of the others, they couldn't really prove what they did, and they were trying to look for this aggravating circumstances which the German law demanded, that simply obeying orders to shoot someone else was not enough. Otherwise, they would have obviously tried hundreds of people. They had a number of people confess to participating, and most of those people were not punished, although 1 or 2 of them were put on trial. The sort of argument was that they'd been kind of told, if you're lower down in the ranks, then please tell us everything you can, and we won't punish you, is kind of what they were maybe told informally, perhaps incorrectly, by the policeman to get them to confess. And there was even arguments about that during the trial, that people were saying, well, we were told that nothing would happen to us, so why are you trying us now? But even the leaders, they didn't do a very good job of convicting them. And that's partly because of the nature of the German law, which was very ill-suited to these kind of trials, and was asking for basically aggravating circumstances. You had to show sort of cruelty in the way it was done, or really strong ideological convictions. And the main people they could prove that for were the Einsatzgruppen leaders, who either sort of committed suicide or were tried after the war or got away in some other way. There were trials also of the police battalion members who were guarding the site. As I mentioned, some of them were even shooting, but again, even the officers there were eventually acquitted with no punishment for Babi Yar specifically. And the sort of argument was that most of them were doing it against their will, but had very strong leaders who threatened them. And although none of them were actually shot or punished in any serious way, they were intimidated enough by the leaders that they didn't dare say anything. And there was even a young Waffen-SS squad that took part. Again, they sort of those members claimed that they didn't participate, although it's fairly clear from other descriptions that they did. Their officer protested about his young men being used for this, but only after they'd done it, and he died during the war, so he wasn't punished either. So it's pretty much a failure on the German trials in the 60s. Another trial of the people who did the exhumations and organized that operation. I think 1 or 2 of them may have been convicted, because they also killed the prisoners at the end of it. But again, a huge amount of evidence was collected, but only 2 or 3 people at most were actually punished. So it's very frustrating. It's good for the history records, and we probably got more because they were fairly mild in their punishments, so people were not so afraid to tell the truth. So it's more like a truth commission in that effect. But in terms of actual punishment of people for what they did, very little came out of it.
Thank you. I think we have 1 more question. Maybe we'll make this our last question, if it's okay with you, and I'll follow up with 1 final question. So this one comes from Harry Joel. Hi, Harry, from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, who was in Europe with him this summer on a project using ground penetrating radar and ERT. So looking at some of these sites. So he writes, interesting research. 2 questions. The first one, with the aerial photos and overlaying with present day imagery, is there discussion of doing subsurface investigations, for example, using ground penetrating radar to locate the edges of the sand pits and the killing areas? And the second question is, do we know where the ashes from the human pyres were placed? In the ravines, in the ravine pits, or spread around the area? And Harry writes, we have seen both in Lithuania.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit familiar, particularly with the Pranari site, which is very similar, especially in terms of its post-war history, that because so much happened to the place after the war, it's hard to determine exactly where the bodies were buried, especially given that some of them were exhumed and burned afterwards. And that's really the big problem in Kyiv, that there's not much left in the ground because of these exhumations. And then subsequently building roads over where most of it took place makes that extremely difficult. I think another big problem in terms of using ground penetrating radar is just first the size and scale of the site. So it would be very expensive for that reason, because you would have to cover a lot of ground to sort of look at all the possible sites there are, and there may be as many as 10 different sites that were exhumed after the war. And then of course the post-war reconstruction of the area, or complete sort of bulldozing of it, does make it quite a bit more complicated. One idea I had, which might be interesting, although it's certainly not easy to achieve, would be to actually look for the fragments of the headstones that were transferred from the Jewish cemetery to form the basis for the funeral pyres. There may have been as many as 50 different funeral pyre sites built, and each one would have had some headstones. And then as far as I can tell from very little evidence, most of those headstones were then buried in the ground around that area to conceal what had happened, but they should still be in the ground. And I imagine that would be the kind of thing that ground penetrating radar can pick up quite easily. In terms of the ashes, there were definitely attempts to spread them over the area, but obviously with such vast numbers of corpses being burned, there will be concentrations, and some kind of scarring, some kind of remains will be in the ground, I'm pretty sure. But again, just the area to be investigated is kind of prohibitive. And then the other problem is that some of that area has been built on since, which again makes it much more difficult to try and do something today. So in principle, it's a good idea, but it works best in sort of greenfield sites where there's nothing there and not too much has changed. This is really now in the city. So although most of it is a park and it would be possible, I think they're more focused at the moment on sort of creating a fitting memorial in that park. And this sort of very interesting work is both expensive and a bit of a distraction to the urgent work of getting this memorial built.
So that's actually the last question that I wanted to ask you on this, on the memorial itself. So we can think about the poem and the notion of that there is no memorial at Babi Yar, but now you're working for the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. So can you tell us a little bit about what the plans are to create a fitting memorial at Babi Yar, and also I would imagine sort of what some of the complexities are about creating a memorial at this site in Kyiv in this day and age?
I'm certainly not the expert on this, so I'll be a little bit careful what I say. If I have about an hour, I could probably explain all the things that have happened since about 2000. It's certainly about the third attempt to build some kind of memorial there. It's always been very hotly debated and contentious, both among activists. I mean, even among all the people who want a memorial built, it's rare that you get sort of three of them agreeing on what should be done. So it has been a long road to get this. I think that the main difference now is we have a government in Ukraine which is definitely in favor of it, and which is trying to sort of force the parties to get together and do constructive work. And we have quite a creative team that's definitely trying to at least put as real markers on the ground, things that will last. Whether this energy will be sustained long enough to get a really large center built will remain to be seen, but we have quite a bit of financial support from wealthy people both in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, and there will be an effort to obviously fund it from worldwide support as well. A couple of big steps have been made this year, but it's still a long road. So I won't predict that success is guaranteed or anything like that. And there are, of course, going to be many criticisms. This has been true of all the memorials, whether it's the Berlin Memorial, even the Holocaust Memorial in Washington took a long road from 77 to 93 to get built. So I think we've made a good start, but there's a lot of things to be decided, and there will be many heated debates ahead, I'm sure.
We will see, but I think, as you've pointed out, it is incredibly important that a fitting memorial be placed at this site to restore some dignity to the victims who were murdered so horrifically at this place. So thank you for your research on this topic and bringing this to light here on the 80th anniversary, as we know how important it is to make sure that this history continues to be taught and taught well. So thank you for your work. I'm going to unmute. I'm going to take a risky step here and unmute everyone so we can have a chance to sort of give you a fitting round of applause here at the end. So I'll do this, and then we can give you sort of the collective round of applause and thank you for your talk this evening. So please join me in thanking Professor Martin Dean for a wonderful, really fascinating lecture this evening. We'll do our round of applause. And thank you again for being here virtually, Dr. Dean, and for joining us this evening for the talk. Thank you again to the Herman and Gertrude Shepard Fund for Holocaust Education for making this talk possible. And I only hope that we can do this again soon in person once we are through the pandemic and have a real opportunity to get together and see each other in person. Moadim l'simcha for everyone observing Sukkot, and Chag Sameach, and thank you all for being here this evening.
Thanks, Avi, very much. It's been very kind.
Thank you.